The quiet hum of the airport echoed as passengers hurried through the gates, rolling suitcases behind them, searching for their boarding passes, and glancing up at the glowing screens that showed their flight numbers. First-class boarding had just been announced, and among the small crowd of people stepping forward was a well-dressed woman with calm confidence in her stride. She wore a neat black blazer, carried herself with grace, and carried the soft smile of someone used to long flights and busy schedules. She was looking forward to finally sitting down and resting before an important trip, unaware that this flight would soon turn into a shocking and unforgettable story. As she stepped up to the counter, the flight crew scanned her ticket without hesitation. Everything seemed normal, but once she walked into the first-class cabin and placed her bag neatly in the overhead bin, she noticed a pilot passing through. At first, it was just a brief glance, one that should have been nothing more than a casual look. Yet there was something in his expression, something sharp and dismissive, that caught her off guard. He leaned slightly toward one of the crew members and muttered words that weren't meant to be heard, but they were. Words that carried insult and disrespect. Words that made her heart sink. The woman froze, unsure whether she had truly heard what she thought she did. A part of her wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, a slip of sound lost in the shuffle of voices and boarding announcements. But the tone was unmistakable, the sting undeniable. The passengers around her went about their business, flipping through magazines, fastening their seatbelts, adjusting pillows, completely unaware that something far more serious had just happened. For a moment, she sat quietly in her seat, holding her composure. Her dignity was intact, but inside she wrestled with a storm of emotions, hurt, anger, disbelief. She was not just any passenger. She was a woman of strength, intelligence, and grace, and she refused to let this moment define her. Yet, she also knew silence in moments like these could be dangerous. She had no idea that what was about to happen next would not only bring truth to light, but turn the entire flight upside down. The crew whispered quietly, their eyes flickering toward her seat every so often. The pilot, calm and almost careless, carried on as if nothing had happened. But what he didn't know was that this flight was about to take an unexpected turn. This woman was not traveling alone. She wasn't just a first-class passenger. She had a husband, a man who had yet to board, a man with power and influence that the crew and the pilot could never have imagined. As the doors were about to close and the last few passengers hurried down the jet bridge, the atmosphere shifted. A tall figure stepped inside, carrying nothing but a leather briefcase and a quiet authority that filled the cabin. His presence drew eyes immediately, though he walked calmly, scanning the seats as if searching for someone. The woman sat straighter, her heart racing, knowing this moment would change everything. The pilot, unaware of who had just entered, was about to learn a lesson he would never forget, and what happened next would leave the entire cabin stunned. The man who had just boarded moved with quiet assurance, every step measured yet commanding. He wasn't in a hurry, but there was an energy about him that made people instinctively step aside. Dressed in a tailored suit, his sharp eyes scanned the rows until they landed on his wife. Her expression gave everything away. Though she sat composed, her lips pressed tightly together, her gaze heavy with unspoken hurt. He didn't need words to know something was wrong. Sliding into the seat beside her, he placed his briefcase under the chair and leaned in just slightly. "Are you all right?" he whispered, his voice steady but filled with concern. She gave a small nod, not one to cause a scene, but the look she gave him told him everything. Years of partnership had taught him how to read her silence. She was holding something back, something that cut deep. He straightened in his seat, glancing around the cabin. The other passengers were oblivious, focused on their drinks and headphones. The flight attendants kept busy with their routines, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the cockpit, almost nervously. He sensed the tension, the kind of atmosphere that whispered of something unsaid. His instincts, sharpened from years in boardrooms and negotiations, told him this wasn't just about a rough flight or simple discomfort. Meanwhile, the woman's mind replayed the moment again and again. The pilot's dismissive tone, the way the words had landed, the sharp sting of being reduced to something less than she was. She had worked her whole life to be respected, to be recognized for her intelligence and character, not judged by appearances. Now, here she was in first class, having paid the same fare as anyone else, yet treated as if she didn't belong. Her husband reached for her hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "Tell me later," he said softly, his eyes reassuring her that she wasn't alone in this. She nodded, grateful for his calm presence, but the unease in her chest wouldn't leave. The pilot had walked past with such carelessness, so confident that his words would remain hidden. That was what made it worse. The assumption that she had no power, no voice. What he didn't know was that her husband wasn't just a frequent traveler or a businessman on another trip. He was the CEO of a major company, one that worked closely with airlines, regulators, and aviation partners. He understood authority, responsibility, and above all, accountability. But for now, he said nothing. He waited, his expression unreadable, allowing the crew to carry on as usual. The plane doors shut with a heavy click, and the safety announcements began. The pilot's voice came over the speaker, calm and practiced, introducing himself as though nothing unusual had happened. To most of the passengers, it was just another voice giving instructions before takeoff. But to one woman, it was a cruel reminder of the insult still echoing in her memory. The engines roared to life, vibrations running to the floor as the plane taxied toward the runway. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, while her husband sat still, his gaze fixed forward, his mind already working. There was no need to rush. Sometimes the most powerful moves were the ones made at the right time, when the truth could no longer be ignored. As the plane lifted into the sky, no one in the cabin realized they were in the middle of a story that would soon make its way beyond those walls. A story of dignity, respect, and justice. And though the tension simmered quietly for now, it was only a matter of time before it rose to the surface. The pilot had no idea of the consequences, waiting just a few rows behind him. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved quietly down the aisles, offering drinks and warm towels. On the surface, everything looked ordinary, but beneath the calm surface, a storm was brewing. The woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window as the clouds drifted past. Her husband studied her carefully, noting the way her shoulders tensed every time the pilot's voice came over the speaker. To everyone else, it was routine. To her, it was a reminder of the words she had overheard, words that stripped away the comfort she should have felt in this seat. Her mind wandered back to earlier that day at the terminal. She had felt proud walking into the airport, dressed neatly, her ticket in hand. Traveling first class wasn't about luxury. It was about necessity. Their schedules were demanding, and the quiet space allowed them to work or rest before meetings that often shaped decisions affecting hundreds of people. She had felt confident, prepared, and respected. Yet with one careless moment, that feeling had been shaken. Her husband leaned back, appearing calm, but his mind was far from still. He thought about the countless boardrooms he had sat in, the contracts he had signed, the deals negotiated with precision. In those rooms, reputation meant everything. Accountability was not just a word. It was a foundation of trust. If a leader failed to show respect to those they served, the consequences were always far greater than expected. He knew this incident was not small. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that could not simply be ignored. Meanwhile, in the galley near the front of the cabin, two flight attendants whispered quietly to each other. They had heard the pilot's remark, though they pretended they hadn't. Both of them exchanged nervous glances, worried about what it could mean if anyone else brought it up. They had families, careers, and mortgages to think about. Saying something could put their jobs at risk. Staying silent, however, left a knot of guilt in their stomachs. One of the attendants stole a glance back toward the woman's seat. She admired how calm the passenger looked, sitting tall and dignified despite what had happened. That quiet strength unsettled her, because she knew she would not have been able to stay composed in the same situation. She turned back quickly when she noticed her husband's eyes briefly shift toward her, as if he could read what she was thinking. The hours stretched slowly as the plane continued its climb through the night sky. Passengers around them settled into movies, books, or quiet naps, blissfully unaware of the unspoken conflict simmering a few seats away. The woman finally turned to her husband, her voice low. "Do you think I should say something?" she asked, her words laced with hesitation. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not yet," he said softly. "Sometimes the weight of truth carries more power when it is revealed at the right moment." She nodded, trusting his judgment, though a part of her longed for immediate justice. The pilot's voice returned once more, announcing their altitude and estimated arrival. It was calm, polished, and professional, so far removed from the remark he had made earlier. To anyone else, it sounded reassuring. To the couple in the middle of first class, it was a mask hiding something unworthy of the position he held. As the woman closed her eyes to steady her thoughts, the husband glanced out the window at the endless stretch of sky. He was not just thinking of his wife. He was thinking of the system that allowed people in positions of trust to believe they could act without consequence. The truth was building step by step, and when it came to light, it would not be quiet. For now, the cabin remained silent, but tension filled every corner. The passengers had no idea that this routine flight was on the edge of a moment that could change everything. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the calm hum of the engines filled the cabin. Most passengers had settled in, unaware of the weight pressing down on one couple in first class. The woman sat still, her fingers lightly brushing the armrest, her mind turning over what had happened again and again. Every time the pilot's voice came through the intercom, it felt like a reminder, almost taunting in its casual professionalism. She forced herself to stay composed, but the silence between her and her husband carried more meaning than any words could. Her husband, sharp-eyed and unshaken, had shifted from quiet observation to careful calculation. He had made a career out of reading people, business partners, competitors, and employees alike. The patterns were always the same. Those who believed their position gave them untouchable power often forgot that authority came with accountability. And when the truth came forward, it struck hardest at the moment of their greatest confidence. The flight attendants passed through the cabin again, pouring glasses of wine and offering small trays of food. To the passengers, it was comfort. To the couple, it was noise around the edges of a storm. The woman caught one attendant's eye briefly. The attendant froze, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it told her everything. She wasn't the only one who had heard. Others knew, and the silence was just fear. Her husband leaned closer. "When we land," he said quietly, "this doesn't stay here." His tone was calm, but his words carried weight. She nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and anticipation. For now, though, they both waited, letting the minutes tick by as the cabin held its secret. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and the overhead bins rattled softly. Passengers stirred, gripping their armrests. The pilot's voice broke through, steady and reassuring, instructing everyone to remain seated. It was the voice of control, authority, command. Yet to the woman and her husband, it rang hollow because they knew what sat beneath the surface. The very person tasked with protecting and reassuring every life on board had already failed the most basic test of respect. She stole a glance at her husband, whose jaw had tightened. He wasn't angry in a loud way. He never was. His power came from quiet authority, from the knowledge that when he finally acted, it would matter. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Hours passed, the cabin darkened, and passengers drifted into restless sleep. But for the couple, rest never came. Every announcement from the cockpit heightened the tension. Every whisper between the crew added to the unease. And with each passing moment, the question grew louder in their minds. How could someone in such a position of trust act with such disregard, and believe no one would ever know? The city lights finally began to appear below, glowing faintly against the darkness. The descent announcement filled the cabin, calm and routine, but inside, the tension swelled. The woman's heart beat faster, her breath catching as she realized they were moments away from what had to come next. Her husband sat forward now, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the seat ahead, as though he could already see the confrontation waiting to unfold. The wheels touched the runway, the soft thud sending a ripple of relief through the passengers. For them, it meant the end of a flight. For the couple, it meant the beginning of a reckoning. The pilot, unaware of what awaited him, carried on as though the flight had been nothing more than another routine journey. But the truth, sharp and undeniable, was about to catch up with him the moment he stepped out of that cockpit. The cabin lights brightened, and the seatbelt sign chimed off. The air was thick with expectation. The woman glanced at her husband one last time, and he gave her the smallest nod, the kind that carried reassurance but also promised that the moment of silence was over. All that remained was the storm about to break. The cabin buzzed with the usual shuffle of passengers eager to grab their bags and exit. Overhead compartments opened and closed, voices rose in tired chatter, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. To most, it was the end of a long flight. But for the couple seated in first class, it was the quiet before a storm. The woman sat upright, steadying herself for what she knew was about to unfold. Her husband, calm as ever, stood slowly, his tall frame drawing a few curious glances. There was something in his posture, an authority that made people pause, even if they didn't know why. As the cockpit door swung open, the pilot emerged, adjusting his uniform cap, his expression relaxed, even proud. He nodded politely at the passengers, as though he had just delivered them safely, unaware of the truth simmering only a few steps away. He was about to pass when the woman's husband moved forward, his presence blocking the narrow aisle. The tension sharpened, but before he could speak, a second voice entered the scene, one that neither of them had expected. From the back of first class, another passenger stepped forward, a man in his late 50s with sharp glasses and a crisp suit. His expression was serious, his voice firm. "Excuse me," he said, directing his words toward the pilot. "We need to have a word before you leave this plane." The entire cabin seemed to freeze. The pilot blinked, confused, then frowned as if annoyed at being stopped. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his voice tight. The older man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small badge. It gleamed under the cabin lights, instantly drawing gasps from nearby passengers. "Federal Aviation Administration," he said clearly, his eyes fixed on the pilot. "You want to stay right here." The woman's breath caught, her eyes darting to her husband. This was no coincidence. The FAA representative, who had been quietly observing the entire flight, now stepped into the center of the conflict. Suddenly, the stakes were higher than either of them had anticipated. The pilot stiffened, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. He looked from the badge to the passengers around him, realizing quickly that this was no ordinary flight anymore. His casual arrogance no longer had a place here. The flight attendants exchanged nervous looks, whispering among themselves. Some passengers who were already standing froze in place, sensing something serious was unfolding. What had been a quiet end to the journey was now becoming something that would be remembered long after they stepped off this plane. The woman's husband stood silently, allowing the FAA officer to take the lead for now. But his eyes burned with focus. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There was more at play than an insult or a careless remark. The presence of the FAA changed everything, bringing a wave of authority that meant this would not stay hidden. The pilot shifted uncomfortably, his voice faltering as he muttered, "I don't understand what this is about." But the silence that followed told him otherwise. Everyone around him knew. The truth was no longer confined to whispers in the cabin. The woman held her breath, her heart pounding. She had expected to face this moment with only her husband by her side. But now, with the unexpected presence of the FAA, the confrontation had escalated into something far bigger than she could have imagined. And as her husband finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting, the cabin leaned in, waiting for what would come next. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the passengers who were halfway through pulling their bags from the overhead bins had frozen, their curiosity anchoring them in place. The pilot stood stiffly, his confident mask faltering under the weight of both the woman's steady gaze and the FAA officer's authority. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. The officer held the badge firmly, his voice low but sharp. "This is not the place to discuss everything, but your conduct has already been noted. You will not be leaving this aircraft without a report." His words sliced through the air, heavy with finality. The crew looked at each other nervously, realizing that what had been whispered behind closed doors was now in the open. The woman's husband stepped forward at last. His calm demeanor hadn't shifted, but his presence was commanding. He looked directly at the pilot, his tone even but filled with unmistakable authority. You spoke words you thought would stay hidden. You believed power and a uniform would protect you. But respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of leadership. The pilot opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to deny or explain, but before he could, the FAA officer cut him off. Enough. Multiple witnesses heard you, and your behavior has crossed a line. Your position does not put you above accountability. The woman felt a rush of vindication. Though she remained silent, her dignity shining brighter than any outburst could have. She knew her husband wasn't just speaking for her, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed or disrespected when they didn't deserve it. The cabin seemed to lean in closer, as though every passenger was holding their breath, waiting for the final blow. Then it came. Her husband reached into his briefcase and calmly pulled out a folder, placing it in the officer's hands. I didn't plan to be here today, he said, his words carrying weight. But perhaps it wasn't by accident. My company has been working closely with airline regulators on leadership reviews across several carriers. Your pilot, he glanced at the man still frozen in the aisle, was already under evaluation. The reveal sent a ripple through the cabin. The passengers exchanged stunned glances, whispers breaking out in the silence. The pilot's face drained to color. He knew now that this wasn't just about one comment overheard by one passenger. This was bigger. His career, his authority, the very position he had taken for granted. It was all collapsing in real time. The FAA officer flipped through the documents quickly, then looked at the pilot with a firm expression. You'll come with me. The words were simple, but final. The crew stood aside, giving them space. The passengers, though silent, were no longer simply observers. They were witnesses. The woman exhaled slowly, her hand finding her husband's. The conflict that had begun in silence had ended with truth laid bare. The man who thought he was untouchable had been held accountable. But just as the couple prepared to leave the cabin, the officer leaned closer to her husband, lowering his voice. There's something you should know. This wasn't the first report about him, and it won't be the last. You've uncovered more than one man's mistake. You've opened the door to something bigger. The words hung in the air like a final twist of fate. What seemed like a single moment of disrespect had revealed cracks in a much larger system, a truth that would follow far beyond this flight. And as they walked down the jet bridge together, the woman realized this was no simple ending. It was only the beginning of a much larger story waiting to unfold. The walk through the jet bridge was quiet, but the weight of what had just happened clung to the couple like the echo of turbulence after a storm. The woman held her husband's arm, not out of weakness, but out of relief that she no longer had to carry the burden alone. Behind them, whispers followed as passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, replaying the moment they had just witnessed. It was the kind of story that would be retold in airports, offices, and dinner tables for weeks to come. As they stepped into the terminal, the FAA officer caught up with them. His tone was calmer now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried in the cabin. I want to thank you both, he said, looking first at the woman and then at her husband. This wasn't easy, but it was necessary. What you brought to light today isn't going to disappear. It's going to push us to look deeper. The husband gave a small nod, his expression steady. We didn't set out to make a scene, he replied. But some things can't be ignored. Respect and accountability aren't negotiable. If someone believes they can hold power and act without consequence, then they should not hold that position at all. The officer tucked the folder under his arm, his eyes thoughtful. You're right, and you've reminded everyone on that plane of something important. Silence only allows the wrong people to keep their place. Speaking up changes everything. With that, he excused himself, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. The woman exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her chest finally ease. She turned to her husband, her voice soft but certain. You didn't just stand up for me. You stood up for everyone who's been made to feel small. He met her gaze and smiled faintly. That's what leadership really is. Not titles, not uniforms. Just choosing to do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. They walked together through the terminal, past families rushing to catch connecting flights and business, travelers glued to their phones. To the world around them, it was just another day. But for them, it was a reminder that change often begins in the smallest of moments, in a word spoken, in a silence broken, in the decision not to look away. Later that night, as they sat together in their hotel room overlooking the city lights, the woman finally allowed herself to rest. The sting of the insult she had endured still lingered, but it no longer defined the day. What defined it was how it ended, with truth, with dignity, and with accountability. Her husband leaned back, thoughtful. You know, what happened today won't stop here. Others will hear about it. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make a difference. She smiled, reaching for his hand. Then it was worth it. The lesson was clear, one that stretched beyond the walls of any plane or boardroom. True respect cannot be demanded by rank or uniform. It is earned by the way we treat others. And when that respect is denied, it is the responsibility of those with courage to speak out. Their flight had begun as an ordinary journey, just another trip from one city to another, but it had ended with a story that would leave a lasting mark, not only on them, but on everyone who had witnessed it. In the end, the most powerful thing was not the authority of the pilot, nor the quiet of the passengers. It was a choice to stand for dignity, even when silence might have been easier. And as the city lights flickered outside their window, the couple knew one truth above all. Respect is not optional, and justice has a way of finding its voice, even at 30,000 feet in the sky.